Okay, so in this video, we are going to very briefly look a little closer at encoding. So most psychologists agree that memory starts with this process of encoding. We are processing information and getting it into our brain, getting it into the memory system. Now, there are two ways that we can process information, or there are two ways that information does get processed, and that is automatic processing and effortful processing. Automatic processing is a term you should be somewhat familiar with because we covered this in chapter 4 when we looked at consciousness. So if you remember, automatic processing is where our brain is collecting and storing information without conscious awareness. So the example I gave is when you first start driving and you're learning, you have to put a lot of effort into that, and you really have to pay attention to every little detail and really think about everything that you're doing. But once you know how to drive, once you have that knowledge securely stored away, you don't have to really think about that anymore. Your brain takes over, or automatic processing takes over, and it will automatically process all of that information as you're driving, and you can think about other things. You can be daydreaming about what you're going to do over the weekend and still be driving. So again, that's similar to what's happening here with encoding in general. When we are learning how to do something, or we're learning a new concept, that's going to take a certain amount of effort in order to process that information and to store that information. So effortful processing is the encoding of details that take time and effort. So for example, what you last studied. If I ask you, give me a brief overview of the last thing you studied. Describe to me concepts related to cognition and intelligence. In order for you to talk to me about that, you need to have encoded it on a fairly deep level. You need to have put the effort into understanding those concepts. And if you haven't done that, then you're going to have a hard time recalling that information. There are certain parts or certain information that can be automatically processed. So automatic processing is the encoding of details like time, space, frequency, kind of the when did something happen, where did something happen, how often has something happened. When it comes to the meaning of the words, think about it. To understand what I'm saying right now, you don't have to stop and try to process every single word and try to figure out the meaning. You automatically process the meaning of words because that's knowledge that is stored away, that you have a good concept of the English language, so you don't need to take the time to process that. That is automatically done. So if I ask you when you last studied, that is something that you didn't need to put time and effort into remembering, but you can probably tell me because that piece of information was automatically processed. Okay? Now, whether or not information gets encoded in the first place really depends on whether or not we're paying attention to it. But then also, it also depends on the extent to which you process that information, how deeply you process that information. If you are not listening to a word I'm saying right now, then first of all, it's not going to be encoded because your brain can't absorb information if you're not listening. But according to the levels of processing framework, there are different processing stages, and they correspond to different depths of information processing, from shallow to deep. So if you are hearing what I'm saying right now, but you're not completely focused or trying to put the effort into processing what I'm saying or trying to understand it, then you're processing the information on a very shallow level. And as much as your brain is receiving the information, it's not doing anything with it. And so you're going to have a really hard time remembering this information later. As you increase your level of processing, deeper processing occurs, and you are more likely to form memories that you'll remember later. So the first step in processing information after receiving it would be labeling it, coding it within your mind. The next step would then be organizing it with similar information that you already have. And then the deepest level would then be connecting those new concepts that you're learning to existing concepts. So as an example, in that last video, the analogy I used was as if your brain is a computer. You all have this existing concept of a computer where you open up a Word document and you type in your information, you save that, and then you retrieve it later. That is a concept you already have, and so by connecting the process of memory with that existing concept that you have, you are much more likely to remember those 3 stages or those three processes within memory, because it connects to something you already have stored. Okay. So something to be aware of as you are studying is how deeply you are attempting to process the information. For those of you that maybe when you study, all you do is read the book, that's a very shallow level of processing. This really distinguishes kind of the lower level grades and the higher level grades. I have, I'll speak to students that will tell me, I don't understand why I'm doing really badly on the exams. I'm reading the book. Well, that's not quite enough. Yes, you're reading it, but are you processing enough for you to actually remember it when it comes time? Maybe as you read it there in that moment, you're like, yeah, I get this, but are you going to remember it? So think about how deeply you are processing it, and if all you're doing is simply reading it, which is essentially the equivalent of just labeling it, then think about ways you can connect that information to existing concepts that you already have good knowledge of. This is why I tell you, think of your own examples of things when you're studying for exams. If you can think of your own examples from your own life, you are much more likely to remember that because it's something personal to you. The more personal you can connect, the more personal information you can connect to the concept, the more likely you'll be able to remember it.